Hi, so we're back with another recipe, and today's recipe is a request from my cousin Sarah, and this is for sourdough starter. So sourdough is intimidating to a lot of people. It was intimidating to me because there's a lot of unknown about it, and a lot of people assume it takes a lot of skill to get started, but it really doesn't. It just takes patience and then a little bit of equipment that you might need to purchase to get started, but not quite a bit. It's a pretty inexpensive hobby, to be quite frank. So what you're going to need some large containers. I like these leftover takeout containers because they're cheap, they're disposable, they're easy to clean. You can run them in the dishwasher, and they have a large opening for if you're really getting in there and stirring your materials and your ingredients. You're going to need very little, half a cup of unbleached all-purpose or unbleached whole wheat flour. I don't recommend buying a whole bag. If you can borrow some from a neighbor or buy some out of a bulk bin, like somewhere like Sprouts, that would be better, unless you're doing a whole wheat sourdough. Like that's all you're gonna feed it, then you're fine, that's not a problem. But I use unbleached all-purpose flour for my bread and the majority of my breads. And I use unbleached because it builds a stronger sourdough. It's going to have a stronger cellular structure. You can use bleached all-purpose flour in a pinch, but your starter itself isn't going to have that strength and that base to it. So if you can find unbleached all-purpose flour, it's really preferable. And then the final thing that you definitely are going to need on hand is a kitchen scale. The reason we need a kitchen scale is you're going to be measuring your ingredients and you want to be consistent. So sourdough is comprised of two ingredients, flour and water, but they have different densities. So these aren't materials that you can just scoop out with a measuring cup and put in your container because it's going to have a different weight at the end. So with a kitchen scale, you can make sure that your measurements are even and it shouldn't be as much of a problem. And then sourdough itself. So what is sourdough? Again, sourdough is comprised of just flour and water. And what it is it's flour and water that have mixed and have fermented at room temperature. What happens is when these ingredients combine together at room temperature and you allow them to sit, they start to ferment. The naturally occurring bacteria and yeast within the flour and then the minerals from the water combine, they feed those bacteria and they feed the yeast cells and they start to grow. So when you see all these little bubbles here, inside of my sourdough, this is the result of the feeding that I gave it. This is a living thing, technically. And every time you feed it, what you're doing is you're boosting its cellular structure. Each feed helps strengthen it. It's going to build out the strong structure that's great for bread or pastry bases. And that's it. It's water and it's flour. You feed it, you let it sit. That's the most important part. And it grows based off of a result like that. So sourdough is used in place of yeast or active yeast in a lot of recipes. You're using naturally occurring yeast versus harvested yeast. Sourdough is great. It's a great source of probiotics. It's good for gut health. And people who might be gluten intolerant can likely actually tolerate sourdough products because what happens is those naturally occurring bacteria and yeast cells within the flour consume and process the gluten. So there's no more in-processable gluten for people who are gluten intolerant. So the gluten has already been processed, it's already been digested, so a lot of gluten intolerant people actually benefit from sourdough recipes. So to get started, super easy. I would recommend starting on a weekend because you have to start, you're working in 24-hour increments. And if you don't have weekend capability, then do it in the evenings where you have consistent time each day to check on your starter. So let's get started. Okay, so our base, the very first feed that we start with, this is going to be the only time we use our whole wheat flour. The reason we start with a whole wheat flour is it has more or a higher concentration of those naturally occurring minerals, naturally occurring bacteria, and the naturally occurring yeast, and it's going to give our starter a good base and kind of a jump start to get going. So what you're going to do in your container, measure out 60 grams of whole wheat flour. It's about half a cup. Almost there. Perfect. And then we're going to add in 60 grams, so equal parts of warm water. This is like not super hot bath temperature water. This is tepid water. Okay, so I have my water. I'm going to add that in, another 60 grams to wake up. So you're going to measure that out, and then you're just going to mix this with a spoon or a fork or a chopstick or whatever you have on hand. It's going to be, I'll show you the consistency. It's going to be like really wet sand. And once that's going, you're going to cover this loosely. You do not want to cover this tight. You want air somewhat to get into this, but you also don't want anything to get fall into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to loosely cover this with the lid, and I'm going to set it aside for 24 hours. And what we're going to check on in 24 hours is we're going to check for bubbles. So that's another reason why I like these containers, is because you can see through on the side. And so when we see those bubbles, we'll know that the yeast cells have activated, and you're going to discard or throw out half of what you have in here, and then replace that with equal parts all-purpose unbleached flour and water. And you're going to do that for about 1 week. So for the first few days, after you see growth, you're going to take out half and throw it away. You can't do anything with it right now. It's not edible. It's not good for anything. So we're going to toss it. And then you're going to add in more. And so what we're doing with those additional feedings is you are resetting the pH of the starter base. You're giving it more of a balance, and you're also giving it a fresh feed. So you're giving it more nutrients for the yeast cells to eat off of. So we'll check back in 24 hours, and I'll show you what our next step will be. Another handy step or handy product to keep on hand, just a simple rubber band or a Sharpie. It does either one. And so what we do with this, and this is going to be super helpful. I just saved these from my produce, like if I buy cilantro or something and it comes with those rubber bands. What you're going to do is mark the side of your starter with this. And so what'll happen, if you're really careful with this and you keep your container clean, you'll be able to tell where your sourdough starter has grown to. So you can tell if it has what we call peaked, which means it has grown, it's reached its maximum height or the maximum ability that it can feed off of the nutrients you've given it, and then it's fallen because you'll see the residue. Or if it has not peaked yet and it's still growing, you'll be able to come here and see, okay, it's doubled or it's just quite half height and I have some time to go. The other thing that you can do to check on the status of your starter after a feed is just take a little spoonful of it and drop it in a glass of water. If it sinks, that means it's either past its peak, if you haven't noticed the growth mark, or it has not yet reached its peak. If it floats, it's good to use, it's active. So that is how you get a starter started. In 24 hours, this will be bubbly. We'll take out half, we'll replace it with water and flour, and then we'll do it all again. Okay, here's the 24-hour update on our initial starter. As you can see, it's softening up a bit, but we are not bubbly yet, which I somewhat expected because it's been a little bit cold and I haven't had the heat on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cover it back up, and I'm going to put it in a warm location, so on my stove under a lamp, and I'm going to leave it here for another 24 hours and then check back and see if we have any activity. Okay, so you can see we have some brown off-put. This is called hooch. It's an alcohol byproduct of the digested grains. And then you can see that we've got some bubble formation here in our flour. So we're going to toss out half of this, add in 60 grams of all-purpose flour and 60 grams of warm water, and then wait another 24 hours until we see activity, and then we'll keep feeding for another 4 days. Okay, we are back after our first all-purpose flour feed, and as you can see, we have grown quite a bit. And if we open it, you'll see your bubbles on the inside. So what we're going to do, we're going to toss out half of this, and then I just do like a rough scoop. It doesn't really matter what you do. You're going to dump it because, again, this isn't really usable for anything right now. And then we'll measure out some new stuff, stir it up, and then let it sit for another 24 hours. Okay, so I dumped out half. I'm going to put in 60 grams of flour. You could just eyeball this or use a measuring cup, but again, we're looking for an even balance of water and flour here so that we know we're getting the same consistency. Okay, and then 60 of water. And there you go. Stir that up. It's gonna be I'll show you the consistency that you're looking for. And then once it activates, it gets really thin because you've got all that air in it and it's digested everything. So it kind of liquefies. But there you go, like a soupy oatmeal kind of consistency. We'll let that sit in a warm spot for another 24 hours, and we'll do this again tomorrow. So this is our second feed. We have 3 more to go. Okay, so here we are, day 4, 3, I've lost count. Super bubbly. Toss out half, 60 grams of flour, 60 grams of water, let it sit again.
That's it. You can't turn it because it's glued to the end. That's it. Okay.
So we're nearing the 12-hour mark from the previous feed, and as you can tell, this is very active. It actually just fell. You can see kind of where it had risen and then sunken back down. So we're not at the 24-hour mark yet. We're at the 12-hour mark. So we need to go ahead and do another feed, because what it means now that it's fallen is it has depleted the majority of the nutrients that it was feeding off of with the last feed. And that's typical for a warmer climate. It's been pretty warm in here. And then our tap water, for whatever reason, generates a pretty active sourdough starter. So these bubbles are starting to rise to the surface. It is starting to sink. So we're going to toss out half and add in another feed. And this is going to be feed number 4. So about 2 more to go, and then the starter will be ready to use. Okay, so I just dumped out half. This is going through feeds very fast and falling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my feeds to 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, just because it's not quite hitting the 12-hour marks in between. It smells very fruity right now, so we're not quite there yet. It's going to smell a little bit sour when it's ready to go. But so I'm going to increase to 100-gram feeds twice a day. And then we have 2 days left. This is feed number 5. This grew 2.5 sizes overnight, so it is now ready to use as starter. For your first use as a starter, we'll discard half, then you'll do a feed, and then as soon as it has reached its peak, you're ready to go. Happy baking!